Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Protests across the U.S. continue for the sixth day, demanding justice for the killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man killed at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis. But it's clear now that these protests aren't just about Floyd. They are protests against a pattern of police brutality and dehumanization of black lives in America. On today's show, we take a closer look at the debate. We also focus on how far the Black Lives Matter movement has come and the role of social media in bringing attention to the cause. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Rashawn Ray, is a professor of sociology, so David M. Rubenstein Fellow, and also attached to the Brookings Institution. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Also joining us today is Ms. Seannice Bamiro, who's a policy advocate. She joins us from Washington, D.C. as well. Thank you both for joining us. Hope you both are safe and well during this time. Dr. Rashawn Ray, let me begin with you. Now, what has happened in the past week or so is being deemed as a turning point in American history, something that will cause about permanent change. Do you have hope for that?
You know, I'm cautiously optimistic for what's happening in the United States. I think it's important for people to recognize that, to your point, Michelle, is that what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd is part of a long history in the United States, a long history and also a recent history that's part of a continuum of police violence, that Black Americans are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking, nor when they have a weapon. Black teenagers are 21 times more likely than white teenagers, 21 times more likely to be killed by the police. And a Black person in the United States is killed by a police officer every 40 hours. When it comes to change moving forward, I do think that the movement for Black lives has made some movement. For one, these issues are being highlighted. We're seeing them caught on film, that people feel the need to interject themselves into these incidents. And I think without video, we might not even be having this conversation today, that the awareness might not have been raised in the United States. We know that body-worn cameras has increased. We know that implicit bias trainings have increased. But these solutions fall short. And one of the things that I've been arguing, particularly in a recent piece in Brookings, is I talk about that bad apples. Oftentimes people talk about police officers as bad apples. These bad apples come from rotten trees. And the rotten trees in law enforcement is imbued with systemic racism. And if we really want to change it, we need to ensure that officers who are fired for police misconduct can never work in law enforcement again. That would have saved George Floyd's life. The officer who killed him had about 18 police misconduct allegations, had charges come before the grand jury before. He should not have been on the streets. We also know that the officers who killed Tamir Rice and Antoine Rose in Cleveland and Pittsburgh, that those two Black teenagers might potentially be alive if the officers were not allowed to go from one department to another department. And then finally, we need to restructure police civilian payouts. In the United States, when someone is wrongfully hurt or killed by the police, there is oftentimes a large civil payment. Those civil payments come from taxpayer dollars. In Chicago, over the past 20 years, the city has paid out over $600 million in police misconduct settlements to citizens. The problem, however, is that these taxpayer dollars are literally paying these people back for their own dehumanization and brutality. Instead, we need to shift this to police department insurances. This allows for police chiefs to then weed out bad apples by noting how much these police officers are costing police departments and the city.
Right. Dr. Ray, you wrote your piece, Their Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees, a very, very powerful piece that you wrote and published in the Brookings Journal. Just to that point about how this brutality comes with impunity for those who commit it, for those who are at the end of the oppression and the violence, committing that violence. I want to take this to Ms. Bamiro and talk to her about this. Now, the impunity and the fact that men, officers, women, those in those powerful positions can get away with doing what they're doing. How long has, how deeply embedded is that in the system?
I'll just follow up on what Dr. Ray said. He brings up a really good point about changing the policies and the procedures in police departments. I would say for one thing, this past legislative session in our state house, we actually advocated for legislation that would make the histories of excessive force and complaints against officers public information. And we received tremendous pushback to even get that to be passed. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the State House closed, and with it also the legislative session. But I also wanted to follow up and say that in police departments, what we're seeing and what our local police department is getting investigated for and sued for is the fact that when officers step forward and tell about the things that their fellow officers are doing, they are getting retaliated against, transferred, and as long as those things can persist, we're not going to get the reforms or the procedures that we want. Instead, it's going to the bad behavior is going to persist.
Right. Dr. Ray, you mentioned here there's a pushback against this change from within the institution itself. Ms. Bamiro also pointed out towards this how police officers that want to call out, who want to be whistleblowers and talk about what's happening, they face consequences. Now, that really brings me to the point of trying to understand what the Black body means. What is the symbolism attached to it in America today?
Yeah, so when it comes to Black bodies in the United States, Black bodies are stereotyped as being perceived as criminal. I think in public space, particularly Black male bodies, but also Black women bodies as well. Part of what that means from a social psychological standpoint is that in people's minds, they perceive that Black bodies are literally weapons. So when I say in my research that Black bodies are weaponized, that means that even when Black people do not have a weapon, even when they're not attacking, they're perceived as being one, and they're perceived as a threat. And so when we look at George Floyd, that's an example of that. But there are several other examples where there have been unarmed Black men and women who have been killed by police or even killed by vigilante justice or so-called vigilante justice. And what's important for people to recognize is that when those particular stereotypes are ingrained in people's minds and then they enact violence on someone else, that has roots in racism. And honestly, the United States has never dealt with this original sin, that racism is built into the very fabric of the founding of the United States of America, even before the birth of a nation, the movie and literally the documents. So when we say that Black bodies are threatened, what that means is it comes along with a set of stereotypes. Black men in particular are perceived as being stronger. They're perceived as being violent. They're perceived as being criminal. They're perceived as being emotionally unstable. So those stereotypes then lead to people justifying actions upon them. And these stereotypes are even heightened when people are nervous, as well as when people do not know the person who they're interacting with, which is oftentimes what happens when we see these particular encounters. Now, with George Floyd and Chauvin, they had worked at the same place before, and it's unclear how well they knew each other. But the whole point is that oftentimes Black people are confused for one another. I cannot tell you, and I'm sure that Ms. Bamiro would agree, that there have been so many times where I've been walking around the University of Maryland, where I've been walking around other universities, where I've been walking in public, and people have confused me for another Black person, for another Black man. And fascinatingly, these are people who should really know what I look like. And so it speaks to the fact that oftentimes people see Black skin, but they don't necessarily attach that skin to a specific face. And those stereotypes collide on the bodies of Black people that actually that create a continuum of police violence that goes from what happened to Christian Cooper in Central Park, where he was stereotyped, and Amy Cooper actually used the damsel in distress and some of the most historic racial tropes we know to exist about what it means for a Black man to potentially threaten a white woman, that we know that police continuum of violence ends with the death of George Floyd.
Right. Ms. Bamiro, the conversation forward, and I just want to change it a little, but I feel like this conversation is important to be had, especially for those who are outside of the United States and want to educate themselves on what is happening. Now, the perception is, being out of the United States as I am, as many other people around me are, is that America celebrates Black culture. We've been seeing the influence of it. We've been seeing the influence of music, films, everything. on how deeply that's impacted American culture. And then when you see that, the power of that, and then you juxtapose it to what's happening to actual Black bodies and Black individuals, it really doesn't make sense. Where does the Black individual stand in American society?
So in American society, Black people are still subjugated. And you bring up a really good point that Black culture and Black contributions are often celebrated and emulated when we see on reality TV shows or just in popular culture. But it's that juxtaposition of like the actual celebration of a Black person and the humanization of a Black person. And it's honestly just not there. And instead, we, experience both overt and covert racism. And until that's really dealt with, we're not going to move forward.
Ms. Bamiro, just one question from you. Now, when we talk about how the Black Lives Matters movement has evolved since its inception, and especially when we talk about how it has changed the discourse, online debates, do you see a change in it, how it's evolved and how it's brought other people into the conversation? Or do you feel like it's still as much as a struggle as it was in 2013?
And when you ask about the struggle, you're talking about like the struggle for Black people to be recognized as human?
Yeah.
So yes, it's still a struggle. Racism, to Dr. Rashawn Ray's point, racism is still deeply embedded in the fabric of our nation. And because of that, until people see us as human, we're still going to contend with those issues. So no, while Black Lives Matter has made progress since 2013, and even Black Americans have made many firsts and gotten many accolades, we're still seen as subhuman in a lot of ways.
Thank you so much, Seannice Bamiro, for joining us and talking to us. Dr. Rashawn Ray, on that conversation of trying to understand, and I'm sorry if I sound ignorant to the matter, but I do want to know better. It seems like, how do we understand this? There was the first Black president of the United States. It seems like there's greater acceptance. And then we see a pattern that echoes what has happened 50 years ago. Have you seen any real progress ever since movements began, this fresh wave of movements began, especially 2013, 2014 forward?
Yeah, I think first I want to say I've never perceived you as being ignorant. In fact, you are one of the most knowledgeable journalists and reporters who I interact with in the media, and your network and your show highlighting these issues is a testament to that. I think part of it is, it's just an honest fact. When we talk about the history of racism in the United States, has there been progress? Yes, there's been a lot of progress, and I think that there are a lot of silver linings. I think part of what we have to recognize is we have to really go back to 1619. And if people want to really look into this, there was an amazing New York Times collection of essays that was put together that actually just won a Pulitzer Prize. And it highlighted how from 1619, when Africans were first brought to the Americas, from 1619 until 1865, people were formally enslaved in the United States. People were formally enslaved in the United States longer than Black people haven't been enslaved. We have to put that in a continuum. Then we had 1865, post-Civil War. The Confederacy, even though it was defeated, was firmly integrated back into the Union. So what happened was that slave owners were given back their land, and in places like Washington, D.C., where I happen to be, where Ms. Bamiro happened to be, that slave owners were actually paid reparations for the slaves that they lost. And then we get to Jim Crow, where we had redlining and segregation. That meant that Blacks and whites were in different neighborhoods, were segregated, were legally sanctioned to be so. And you can take maps from 1920 and overlay them with maps from 2020. And what people will see in cities like Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Memphis, St. Louis, is that Black people and white people are basically in the same neighborhoods they were a century ago, and those neighborhoods are structured by social class. And so what's happening right now, the spillover into the streets is part of that legacy. So has there been progress since 1965? Yes. In fact, when we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, it could be argued that Black Americans have made more progress in a span of 55 years than any other group in American and potentially human history. But that is not the narrative that we frame. So in spite of racism, in spite of racism, we've been able to make progress, but it's still there. So as we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we are dealing with two pandemics. We're dealing with COVID-19 and we're dealing with racism, which is the pandemic we've never dealt with.
Right. Those are important words, and I'm going to continue with that. We're joined by Miss Janna Parker, who's a community advocate and activist. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Ms. Parker, for taking out the time and talking to us. Now, just focusing on what is happening on the streets, the mood and the atmosphere. One of the things I've noticed on social media and through mainstream channels is the coverage of the looting and the destruction that's being caused, despite community leaders coming out and saying that these are individuals who are hijacking the movement. But it seems like that's how the discourse and the narrative regarding the protests is shifting. Do you feel that too?
I do feel like that is part of the way that the media is trying to frame the narrative. I think it's important to realize that property and destruction, no one is saying that that's okay, but we're not saying that someone's life means more than destruction of property. The issue comes in is when you have peaceful protests, you have masses of people peacefully protesting, and then these outliers are coming and destroying property on a grand scale and trying to connect it to the movement of a peaceful protest. That is the issue. I think another thing to take into a perspective is the way that the police are responding to peaceful protests of this murder, as opposed to the way that they responded to a protest and where they were armed citizens coming to state capitals, right, protesting, being, protesting a stay-at-home order for their own safety. So that's something to take into account as well.
Right, and just the fact that moving a couple of years and talking about the Colin Kaepernick discussion and how that caused a lot of outrage, because on the sports field, you don't want to see politics, you don't want to politicize that game, that sport, that, that happy hour. And we see the reaction that got, and now we see when protests like these happen, the reaction you get to this. Is there any space for protest for the Black individual without it being perceived as, unacceptable, even though it's a constitutional right to protest?
I think that there has always been this theme that Black people cannot speak against the injustices that they are receiving within this country, because it is somehow deemed as being disrespectful to a country that we helped build, right? And so with that thought process, it is almost like, okay, I can't protest peacefully. It's improper to protest violently, yet I'm supposed to sit and suffer in silence. And if I don't say anything, then you'll say, oh, hey, you're fine with it. So I think that in that space, people need to continue to push in these protests and to lean in harder. I think you brought up a good point. There was this peaceful kneeling protest in relation to the injustices that were going on. And there was such a visceral reaction to that.
Right.
But now that there's these other peaceful protests and there's still a visceral reaction to it. It's almost like they're saying, be quiet, shut up, take this abuse. And if you are quiet and you take this abuse, that means that you're okay with it, and we're not.
Right, and the fact that almost more than 1,600 individuals across the United States have been imprisoned, have been taken into custody by the police for what has happened, and the 3 policemen who were involved have not been arrested. That speaks volumes. Do you think if that happens, the rest of those other 3 officers, we will see an end to these protests?
So the protests, I don't, because the protests are they're showing a bigger issue that is
Right.
consistent. Like there is a consistent level of violence from police to people of color, specifically Black and Brown, that is essentially outside of what the scope of justice should be. These are actual murders. These are actual instances of police brutality.
Right.
And arresting these officers would be a step in the right direction. Their convictions would be even a more step. But the best thing to do is to change the policies, the procedures, the laws, the legislation that protect and enable these sort of violent acts against a community a community of American citizens by the force that's supposed to protect them.
Right. Dr. Ray, I'm going to end the segment, but before that, I just want to make an effort to humanize the issue we're talking about. Now, you are a Black man in America. You have children, boys, as I know. What are the fears you have as an individual, as a parent? And given the situation and how it's progressing, how do you have that conversation with your kids?
You know, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I study these issues. I research these issues. I help inform policymakers. And I've studied policing for a decade, and I struggle on how to have conversations with my Black boys about what it means to grow up Black in America, the ways that their Black skin is going to be weaponized and criminalized. And I worry about the day that they instantaneously go from cute to criminal. It is one of the biggest worries. And when you have Black kids, particularly Black boys, I read something recently that I agree with. It said, when you have Black boys, you start to pray differently. And that is literally the truth, that if I have difficulty talking about these sort of things, then I know everyone else does. And all we want at the end of the day is for people to be able to come home safely. And what I know as a man growing up in America, that I've been stopped more times by the police than my age. I've been thrown up against walls by the police. I've been arrested by the police. I've been stopped while studying, while running, while walking, while clubbing. And I shouldn't have to say it, but as you noted, I have a PhD. I'm a professor at a major American university, and I do not have a criminal record. That is what policing does, and that's the reason why people are in the streets. And what I tell my boys is I aim to help them have coping strategies and help to arm them for what they're going to deal with. I don't give them this utopia as if America or the world is equitable, as if they're not going to be vilified and weaponized. And I aim to have those conversations with them.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Rashawn Ray, and thank you so much, Ms. Janna Parker, for joining us. Hope you and your families remain safe throughout what is happening in the United States at this point in time. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we discuss U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to suspend ties with the World Health Organization. Stay with us. Welcome back. U.S. President Donald Trump suspended funding to the World Health Organization last month. But now he takes that a step further. On Friday, Trump made the decision to permanently cut ties with the organization. This will be a devastating blow to the World Health Organization, as the United States is by far its biggest contributor. Let's take a closer look at this development and the implications of it. Joining us for this conversation today is Dr. Andrea, who's a global health expert and CEO of Health Finance Institute that builds investment partnership for chronic diseases, disease prevention and treatment. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Also joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Emily Smith, who's an epidemiologist, and she is also the editor-in-chief of the website COVID101.org. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Andrea Fiegl, I'd like to begin with you. Now, what are the implications of this suspension? We've known and we've seen an attack on the organization by the president for a long time coming, throughout the pandemic, in fact, but now actually making this permanent decision to cut ties. How is that going to impact the struggle for the World Health Organization to stay afloat?
First of all, whether this decision is permanent or not has yet to be seen, because generally the funding for the World Health Organization is approved by Congress, by the Appropriations Committee. So there is still a question of legality of this decision. However, let's assume it was permanent. The U.S. spends about short of $500 million per year in terms of voluntary and assessed contributions to the WHO, making up around 20% of the budget. So you can imagine that's really, really a large chunk of the organization's funding. And even with potentially the European states and China stepping up, it leaves or would leave a huge leadership vacuum. So on one hand, it's devastating for the organization in the middle of a pandemic. And secondly, the question is, can other member states step up, and what does it mean for the pandemic? Thirdly, given that the U.S.
I just want to pick up on that point you mentioned here, the fact that there will be a leadership vacuum. Do you think that might leave space for other voluntary members to now, in fact, leave and not contribute as much to the World Health Organization when they see that the role of it has become futile?
There's certainly, I think currently in the pandemic, there is a really strong support of the World Health Organization. So within the immediate future, I don't really see that happening, that other countries would leave. I think the organization has shown strong leadership as of recent when it comes to the pandemic, providing technical assistance and supplies. That is absolutely critical when you look at the crisis in Latin America and beyond.
Right.
So I would say that in the short term, that is not what's written on the wall.
Right. Stay with me, Dr. Fiegl. I'm going to back to you, but I want to bring Dr. Emily Smith into this conversation. Dr. Emily Smith, the attitude towards the World Health Organization that has been seen, the fact that it has given cover to China, the fact that almost there has been this political targeting of this organization, how has that impacted discussions within the medical community in the United States?
What is clear is that this is a political distraction, but among my colleagues and from official statements from groups like the American Association of Infectious Disease, the Infectious Disease Society of America, even the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, have all confirmed that we stand strong with the World Health Organization and that as scientists, we will continue to collaborate and support the WHO mission.
Right. And just to understand how important the mission has been during this time, how has it been handling the global situation, in your opinion, especially acting as a forum for various experts and scientists across the world to coordinate what is happening?
This has been so important. And historically, this is what WHO has always been good at. They have acted as a neutral global body to allow scientists to convene and discuss and organize ourselves. That's hard to do as we all work at individual institutions or with individual governments. But in my work in the last decade, this has been the main way I've worked with WHO. As they come together, they offer opportunities for convening, opportunities for collaboration. And in my work, this has always been, it's never been a problem. The way everyone comes together to collaborate has been through WHO coordination. And that has been more important than ever as we look to find answers about the novel coronavirus.
Right. Dr. Andrea Fiegl, as we talk about this, and Dr. Smith, you yourself reiterate the fact how important it is to have this organization during this time. We know when the pandemic first initially broke out, the World Health Organization, for many experts, wasn't being as proactive as it should have been. There was a delayed in response in actually declaring it a pandemic. There were many things that seemed to be going that the organization was ignoring or giving leverage to China for it. Do you see that actually being a problem and that being a discussion worth having?
I think that there's definitely a discussion that's worth having, but let me emphasize, as I've mentioned before, there's a time for criticism and there's a time to come together. And right now, we are still fighting this global pandemic. So we should take note of the things that could have done better. And I'm sure with all the reforms that are happening, WHO is willing to be a learning organization. But right now, when we're still facing a race towards a vaccine, when we still need technical assistance and scientific collaboration, WHO has a critical role as a convening partner. So it's kind of like trying to fix an airplane mid-flight.
Right. But talking about problems that do need to be talked about and do need to be recognized in order for them to be rectified in the future. Now, you look at the overall infrastructure of health financing, and what COVID-19 has done has allowed us to see the brokenness in many systems, especially many healthcare systems across the world. Are there things that stand out to you that need immediate change after we get through this, and even during this process when it comes to how health is financed across the world?
Absolutely, and this is really a really great question. I think that we have really, this crisis has shown that we don't have a lot of surge capacity, that we don't have a lot of testing capacity, and that supply chains are really, really fragile. So strengthening supply chains and having a little bit of that surge capacity when it comes to ventilators and a global infrastructure for data sharing is absolutely critical to invest in. And also for sort of the second surge of the pandemic, which is predicted for the fall.
Right. Dr. Emily Smith, keeping with that question, are there things you would like to add, and what needs to be changed about the system at large?
I think the point that I work on is related to data sharing and harmonized efforts at protocols for clinical trials. So this relates to vaccines and treatments as well. So a priori, we need plans for this. And definitely WHO has in the past prepared some of these plans, but of course, we could be more prepared. And so from my point of view, in terms of medical and public health research, establishing right now these protocols for data sharing and for harmonized medical research globally, and for the specific plans about how and when we will share data and we will pool data together is important.
Right, and we know, right, leading up to this, what heard a lot in the world was that we're living in an age of information wars, the weaponization of data. Now, talking about this, are there more clear guidelines? Do you feel like there is a clear guideline of the type of data that needs to be shared and when to put those information wars to one side?
Yeah, so that's what I think a lot of us are spending time working with WHO right now, is establishing the very specific guidance about when we will do that. And so WHO has taken leadership in all areas in convening scientists to make these decisions right now. So it's in progress.
Right. Dr. Andrea Fiegl, now this is a question that's come a lot on social media and also in discussions, especially when people give air to controversies. And I don't want to give air to controversies, but I do want to talk about the idea that the World Health Organization is disproportionately influenced by contributors, especially when we look at foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example. How do you pick this matter apart? How do we understand it better?
Development aid has always been used for exerting soft power. So it has been used traditionally both to do good in the world, but undoubtedly also to exert soft power. So yes, the soft power that has been exerted both by the US, by China, by potentially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that definitely is something that should, in my opinion, be looked into, that countries and country priorities shouldn't be sidelined based on donor agendas. So in terms of aid harmonizations, there are some great treaties, the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, for example, that says countries should be in the driver's seat. So this is a health financing reform issue that could definitely be looked at when health financing at organizations like the WHO and others is taken into account.
Right. Now, given all of that, as you mentioned, that's important to keep in light of the fact that what is happening right now is happening during a pandemic, and all these discussions are happening during a pandemic. Coming back to if the role of the World Health Organization is weakened, what is the worst case scenario, one that you fear happening, especially while we're in the midst of a pandemic and many countries haven't even reached their peaks yet?
Worst case scenario probably would be other countries deciding to defund an already underfunded organization, that the US's decision does become permanent, and that it leaves critical supply chain support, technical assistance, data sharing, the ability to convene at risk. and that some of the funding that is being pledged right now does not support and strengthen, but creates parallel systems and inefficiencies. A lot of the funding right now pledged goes to other organizations like Gavi and Global Fund, and there needs to be coordination.
Right. Dr. Emily, just one last question to you before we end this. Do you echo those sentiments there, those fears that this is what's going to happen if the role of the World Health Organization is continuously undermined?
Those are all important concerns, and I will add that I think the most likely is that underfunding slows our work down, right? And we're all looking to move faster and better right now under a constrained system. We're all public health is in general underfunded in our countries and globally, and so there's a lot of work being done by a constrained system right now. And so further eliminating funding and expertise means we'll move more slowly, and of course that puts everyone's health at risk.
Right, and those are important comments. Thank you so much, Dr. Emily Smith, for joining us, Dr. Andrea Fiegl for joining us, and thank you for your work and the contributions during this time, during this pandemic, helping us all try to understand it better. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.